Hey, good afternoon. It's Saturday, March 9th, and welcome back to Everyday Talk 24/7. Such a privilege to be with you. Love seeing what God's doing as He begins to bring spring to our part of the world, and just the beauty of the spring blossoms in the trees. The video today, the title might seem a little bit different, but think about this carefully. Obedience. It's the blessing by which we can know God better. The blessing to know God better. It's not about making us more acceptable to God. Christ has already done that. It's not about earning our way, but it's the opportunity to know Him more deeply. And that's Paul's prayer for the Ephesians. That's what we've been talking about. That's what this whole series is about. Remember in chapter 1, verse 17, Paul says, I keep asking that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the glorious Father, may give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation so that you may know Him better. That's what Ephesians is all about. There are other things, but that's a key theme in Paul, what he's communicating to us here. So when we start the practical section of application in what we call chapter 4, remember, chapter 4, these chapter headings are not in the original, but they were added on. But what we call chapter 4 begins, as a prisoner for the Lord then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling, and this is important, of the calling you've received. Be completely humble and gentle, patient, bearing with one another, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of the peace. He's interested in this relationship of being close together. And then after he talks about the church, we looked at verses 17 to 19, where he says, don't live the way the Gentiles do, according to their own desires, where all they care about is knowing themselves and pleasing themselves. He says, you didn't come to know Christ that way. That's what he says in chapter 4, verse 20. You, however, did not come to know Christ in that way. He's concerned about us knowing God more deeply, more intimately. Not the way the Gentiles do, the people who don't know God by chasing after their own desires and honoring their own desires above everything else, wanting to know themselves first rather than knowing God. He says, you didn't know Christ that way. And then he says, you must put off these old ways, the ways of the Gentiles, serving your desires first and your needs first and the things that you want to be involved with first. Put that off and put on this new person that you were created to be. Not to be more acceptable, not to have a legalism standard, not to say I've done this and I've obeyed that and I'm therefore better, but to know God more deeply. So then in verse 25, when he begins this section of the put-offs and the put-ons, notice what he says. Therefore, that's the first word. Therefore, according to what? Don't live the way the Gentiles do, but therefore, since you didn't come to know Christ that way, live this way. And then he begins the exhortation. And he says, therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to his neighbor, for we are members of one body. Calling us this unity where we get to know Christ more deeply. Now, the wording Paul uses here is significant. He's quoting Zechariah chapter 8, verse 16, where when the Jews are getting ready to go back to the promised land, Zechariah says this from the Lord. He says this same thing. You must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor. Paul is reminding us of just as these people in Zechariah's time were getting ready to start a new journey back to Jerusalem, back to reclaim the promised land, and that we would be a part of too. He's saying to these Ephesians, as you start this new journey of walking with God, of the opportunity to know Him and know Him more deeply, he says, therefore you must put off the falsehood and speak truthfully, because we are members of one body. In other words, we are members, we are people together called to know God more deeply, to know Him better. So these things that we're going to be looking at in the next several days have to do with knowing God better. And this section ends, again, with what we call chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. He says, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering. He repeats what he said at the beginning of chapter 4. He says, live a life worthy of the calling you receive. Be imitators of God, therefore. So all these things in between have the purpose of knowing God more deeply. So obedience is a blessing by which I can know God more deeply. I'm involved in God's things. If you want to know someone, you get interested in the things that they're interested in. And the more you're interested with them, and the more you involve yourself with them, the tighter this bond becomes. Instead of sitting back and saying, this is hard, I'm not going to do it, or, okay, I'll do it, but Rather, he eagerly is saying, get to know God, know more deeply, and use obeying him not as a means of approval, but as a means to know him. So I speak the truth in love. I put off falsehood and I speak truthfully to my neighbor. It draws me closer to God. It builds a relationship with the people that I love and know. I'm not being led around by my desires and what I want. I'm being led by what's going to bring honor to God. And that's going to bless my relationship with him and with the people that I love and the people he's called me to love. See what he's doing here? It's a beautiful, beautiful message. It recasts obedience for us from something I'm doing to earn points or check off on a list to saying, these are the things, the intimate, relational things that I can do to know God more deeply, to know him better, just as Paul is praying, so that our relationship with him will blossom and grow and keep growing for all the days that we're here on the planet. What a beautiful way of looking at what it means to obey God. Not to earn his favor, but to know him more deeply. So therefore, put off the falsehood, speak the truth, and keep that bond of unity together, both with your neighbor and with God. What a rich blessing. Again, give me some thoughts and feedback. Thanks so much for participating in the Q&A Friday. And you have a good Lord's Day tomorrow, and Lord willing, we'll see you on Monday. You have a great evening. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching. May God richly bless you as you seek to live for his glory.